In this series, we're trying to understand the whole of the Bible. And we're focusing at the beginning very much on the opening chapters of Genesis, because that really sets the scene for everything that happens in the rest of the Bible. Now, when we read these accounts, there are a couple of different ways that we can look at it. Some people, and myself included, we see no reason why this cannot be a factual historical account. And where that seems to be a difficult thing to believe, I'm really happy to talk to you about options and possibilities about why that might be the case. However, I also recognise that other people think of these stories as allegories. An allegory, it's a story that kind of parallels something. It seeks to explain something very complicated, but in a simple way, so that it's much easier to grasp what's going on. And some Christians recognise these stories more as a way to explain something more complicated. Genesis 2 finds us in a wonderful situation. Everything is marvellous. God and humanity are working, cooperating together there in the Garden of Eden. But then Genesis 3, things go really, really badly. And that's what we're going to look at today. So it's entitled The Fall, which is kind of the term that Christians use for this event. Or my subtitle is, It Wasn't an Apple, but It Did Go Pear-Shaped. So there, in the Garden of Eden, God puts out loads of trees that are good to eat. They can pick whatever they like. It's all marvellous. It's wonderful. But there is one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God says, don't eat from that tree, otherwise you will die. Now, what's all that about then? Why would God do that? Because it seems at the very least careless, or maybe it's just like completely mad, stupid thing to do. I mean, if I invited you round for dinner, I would not spread out a load of dishes on the table and say, help yourself, it's all good, it's all wonderful. Oh, by the way, that one plate of food there, that's poisoned. If you eat from that, you're going to die. Now, you'd have be shocked if I did something like that, wouldn't you? You'd say, well, that's a stupid thing to do. Quick, take that plate away, take the danger away. So why has God done this? Why has he put this tree there and says, if you eat from there, you're going to die? Well, let's understand the situation they're in. God has given them free will. They are in the world, they have complete free will, and yet their free will is pretty meaningless. There are no consequences. There is nothing that can go wrong. There is nothing for them to show any kind of trust in God, any kind of relationship with God in terms of doing what God says. And God wants to put in front of them a very clear choice. A choice of, are you going to cooperate with me or not? Are you going to trust me or not? Are you going to believe that what I tell you is the best, or are you going to go off on your own way? Two words that can be used to describe this are autonomy or theonomy. In autonomy, you're basically saying, I will do whatever I feel like. There's no higher authority, I will choose what to do. Theonomy says, well, I recognise God as a higher authority, I may be able to make a decision, but I choose my free will to follow what God says is the right way to do things. And right there in the Garden of Eden, God presents them with a choice. Autonomy or theonomy. Are you just going to use this life to do whatever you feel like and recognise there are consequences? Or are you going to recognise that actually I'm telling you the best way to do this? I've designed you to live a certain way. Will you submit to what I'm telling you is the best way? Will you have autonomy or theonomy? And that choice is presented throughout the Bible. That's why it's one of the massive themes of the Bible. That choice is presented to us today. It's presented to you today. Autonomy or theonomy? Do you want to go your own way? Or do you recognise that maybe God's way is better than anything you could come up with? Well, you probably know the story. Adam and Eve, they choose autonomy rather than theonomy. They choose to do their own thing rather than to do the thing that God tells them to do. And as a result of that, a load of terrible, awful things happen. There are consequences to their choice. And it's interesting to note that these are not punishments. They're not punished for what they do. It is simply that there are consequences when we make the wrong choices. Here's a few of the key consequences that happen because of what they did. First of all, selfishness comes into the world. This is the first case we see here of someone putting the blame onto somebody else, where Adam puts the blame on Eve, Eve puts the blame on the serpent. It's also the first time when people care what they look like. They saw that they were naked and they were ashamed. People are caring about what others think of them for the first time. That selfishness comes into the world. Second thing, death comes into the world. Third thing, the whole physical earth is corrupted. All kinds of bad things start happening on the earth. And lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, this is where the inequality between men and women that we are still fighting against today, that still rears its ugly head in so many shapes and forms across our planet. That is not God's plan, that is not God's way, and it comes into being here, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of their actions. So when everything goes wrong, how does God respond? Well, there are two sides to this. Firstly, there is the big picture, the big plan, which is what the rest of the Bible is about, and I'm going to come into more detail in the future. But we get a hint, a clue about what's going to happen in Genesis 3:15, where God says to the serpent, "I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." In other words, a child is coming who is going to destroy the works of the serpent, the enemy. And we know that that is Jesus. Jesus is going to come, he is going to be born of a woman, and he is going to put right huge amounts of everything that has gone wrong. So that's the big plan that's coming. But what about the short term? What's God's immediate response? And the answer to that is, he asks questions. It's really interesting that when that relationship is broken and God has a choice what he's going to do, what he chooses to do is to ask questions. It says that he comes into the garden as he usually would. And Adam and Eve, they run away and they hide. They are choosing to separate themselves further from God. They're putting distance between themselves and God. And what's God going to do? Because he's got some choices here. Now, he is the creator of the universe. He knows exactly where they are. But he asks a question. In fact, the first question he asks is, "Where are you?" But I want you to understand, the reason he's asking questions is because that is the best alternative that he has. You see, if it was me, I might have gone storming into the garden saying, "What are you playing at, you idiots, you stupid fools? Didn't I tell you not to do that? Didn't I tell you that all kinds of things would go wrong if you did that? Why have you done that?" That might be my kind of response. And how would they have reacted? If God comes in there and he sees them hiding behind the bush, the tree, wherever they're hiding, he could have kind of clicked his fingers and made the bush disappear and go, "What do you think you're playing at hiding? You can't hide from me. Get over here." Again, that's a terrifying prospect. So what God actually does is, he asks a question. You see, in asking a question, Adam and Eve have the chance to think about how they want to respond. They can stay in hiding if they want. Not that they're really hidden, but if that's where that they're feeling safe and comfortable and they choose to stay there for a bit longer, well, they have that choice. Or they can think, well, it's time to stop running. It's time to stop hiding. God is being reasonable here with me. God is asking the question, "Where are you?" So I'm going to come out and I'm going to talk to him. It's a way to restore relationship. When our relationships are broken with people, very often we either want to have nothing to do with them or we want to go and have a big rant at them. And actually what God is demonstrating here is that a brilliant way to begin to restore any relationship is actually to start asking some questions, to start having a dialogue. So the next thing we're going to look at is precisely what questions does God ask and why does he ask them? There are actually three types of question that God asks in this kind of situation. The first one I've mentioned already. It is, "Where are you?" And in asking this, I don't think God's really thinking about the location, he's thinking about the situation. So in other words, when Adam hears this, Adam, where are you? He doesn't just think to himself, well, I'm here behind this tree. He's really asking the question, where do you find yourself? Adam's thinking, where am I? I'm hiding. I'm rebelling against God. I'm disobedient to God. I find myself in broken relationship with God. So in asking this question, God's really saying, where do you really find yourself? What situation are you in at the moment? The second thing he asks is, who told you you were naked? But this type of question is really saying, who are you listening to? If you are only listening to God and what God says, you will go down a certain kind of a path. If we start listening to other things, we find ourselves going down a different path. So God says, who are you listening to? And then thirdly, he asks a couple of questions. He asks, have you eaten from the tree? What have you done? And it's this question, what have you done, which is the critical one. Funnily enough, in Genesis 4, after Cain has murdered his brother Abel, then God asks him the same question, what have you done? And God is really not asking because he doesn't know the answer. He knows exactly what Cain had done. He knows exactly what Adam and Eve have done. So when God asks the question, what have you done? He's really saying to you, what have you done? What have you done? Do you understand the implications of what you've done? Do you understand the consequences of what you have done? So let's explore how those three questions might apply to us now. First question, where are you? Where do you find yourself at the moment? I don't mean, are you sitting in your home or on a bus or whatever? Where do you find yourself? Are you, for example, a believer in God? Are you an atheist, somebody who firmly believes there is no God? Are you somewhere in between, an agnostic? Maybe somebody who doesn't know if it's possible to know God. Where are you on that question? Today, are you close to God? Or are you far from God? Today, are you hiding from God? Are you feeling shame and a guilt, maybe, which makes you want to pull away from God? Or actually, are you feeling that love and that closeness and that drawing close to him? Are you surrendered to God at the moment, yielded to him, willing to do the kind of things that he's asking of you? Or do you find yourself unwilling to surrender? Do you find yourself being pulled towards that autonomy and saying, no, I just want to do what I want. I don't want to consider that there might be a higher authority. Are you angry with God? There's a lot of stuff going on in the world. You may have been through some difficult times, either recently or in the past. It is completely valid if you find yourself today angry with God. That doesn't mean to say that that relationship cannot be restored. Do you find yourself today in a comfortable position? Do you find yourself in an uncomfortable position? Do you find yourself in a too comfortable position where things are just going kind of so right that you find you need a challenge? You want more? Wherever you are, whatever kind of answers you're coming up to those questions, the great thing is that God wants to restore relationship with you. So he starts with where you're at. Whether you're close or far, surrendered or unwilling to surrender, angry or loving, wherever the point is that you are, God asks you the question. He knows where you're at. He knows where you feel you are in your relationship with him. But examine yourself. Do you know where you're at? And if you're not happy with where you're at, what might you do about it? The second question, who are you listening to? Sometimes when that temptation comes, when there's something we just feel like doing, we think, oh, blow the consequences. It's like sometimes that little child inside, where when you're a kid and you just go off and you do it and you don't really think about what's going to happen as a result until it's too late. Are we listening to that temptation inside? Are we listening to society's, either their approval or disapproval of things? I was talking a few weeks ago about these stories that we tell ourselves. Stories like the domination story or the purification story, the isolation story. Are we blaming other people? Are we trying to be the one on top? Are we saying that we're not good enough? Are we saying that we're trapped or a victim? There are all these stories that are pressing in on us. Are we listening to those? Who are you listening to? Or are you listening to God? Are you listening to what God says about you? Is this today a reminder that you can ignore those other stories and just listen to who God says that you are and restore that relationship with him? And the third question, what have you done? If you look at how you've done things with your life so far, if you look at where you're up to, if you look back over all of the things of the past, what have you done? Are you happy with what you've done? Do you have regrets over what you've done? Do you wish that there are things you could change about what you've done? And God says to you now, you need to recognise what you've done, but actually you're not trapped by what you've done. You're not stuck in the past. You are a product of your past, but you are not a prisoner of your past. And recognising what you've done, recognising what the past is to you, God says today you can restore that relationship and you can start to go forward, moving on from the past into a brighter future. So in these opening chapters of the Bible, we're seeing some principles that hold true for the whole of the Bible, and they're going to keep coming up again and again, which is why it's worth putting quite a lot of effort into focusing on them right at the beginning. We've seen that creation was for us, so that we could have relationship with God. We've seen that God gives us free will, and we have that choice to make. Am I going to live in autonomy? Am I going to live in theonomy? Am I going to ignore any higher authority and just do whatever I feel like? Or am I going to try and follow what God says? We've recognised that there are consequences if we take the autonomy route, because God's ways are there to help us have the best life possible. So if you ignore the best life possible, then things are going to go wrong. Things are not going to be as good as they would be if we were following God's ways. And that means that there will be consequences to choosing autonomy over theonomy. Not punishments, consequences. We've also learnt today that if we break relationship with God, that God doesn't come down on us like a ton of bricks. He doesn't come down in a demanding, angry way. What he does is he comes immediately and persistently to try and restore that relationship. He comes asking those questions so that we can examine ourselves, so that we can have a think about what we've done. We can think about the position that we find ourselves in. And that gives us our chance to come back to God. So, what are those three questions? And how are you going to respond? Today, where are you? Where are you in the relationship with God? Who are you listening to? Are you listening to voices that are positive, voices that help you? Or are you listening to the negative voices which push you down the wrong paths? What have you done? Do you understand the implications of what you've done? Are you happy with the route that you're going along based on what you've done? Or today, do you want to come out from wherever you're hiding and recognise who you've been listening to say sorry for the wrong things that you've done? And if you've done right things, to receive God's well done, good and faithful servant to those who are doing the right things. But ultimately, will you have a conversation with God and answer those questions as you talk to him?